The iPhone 13s are here. So this is everything you need to know in less than 17 minutes. What I liked, what I really didn't like, and then if I think these new iPhones will actually beat the competition. And I do have something that I want to call them out on. Okay, so on the face of it, the iPhone 13s look pretty similar to the iPhone 12s. There's 4 phones, a 13 mini, 13, 13 Pro, and 13 Pro Max. And each of them is almost exactly the same shape and size as their equivalents last year. This is just kind of how Apple rolls. Because unlike companies like Samsung and Huawei, who come up with a practically new design language every single year to differentiate themselves, Apple knows that the iPhone design is iconic, and so I think they almost try to make sure that they don't change it too much, which makes the most obvious visual difference between generations usually just the color. But this is actually the first thing. I'm actually pretty happy with what they've delivered this time. For the normal iPhone 13 and 13 mini, there's 5 total colors. The new pink is kind of whatever, but I really like the red this time round. It actually looks like red. And then for the Pros, every single year Apple has a few standard colors, which tend not to change. Because fun fact, black and white are actually the most popular colors over time. But they also always have a hero color, the one that they always use in all the promotional material, and the one that they make sure is different so that true fans can have that "I got the new iPhone" feeling. It was midnight green for the 11 Pro, Pacific blue for the 12 Pro, and we now have Sierra blue for the iPhone 13 Pro. It might just be my favorite color yet. It's almost Mr. Who's the Boss blue. The only slightly annoying thing is that they've kept the same ultra-high gloss side rails from last year, which will probably make the phone almost impossible to keep clean. Anyways, I'm also just glad that the notch is smaller. Ever since the iPhone X first came out, this notch hasn't budged. And as each new generation of Android phones have come out, its presence has become just that little bit more unwelcome. So no, they haven't got rid of it entirely this time, but it is about 20% smaller, thanks to the earpiece being pushed up to the top bezel. And I think that's just enough such that it keeps parity with its rivals. It means that we have just this little bit of extra usable screen on top, which, who knows, if Apple's feeling cheeky, might mean we get the battery percentage icon back. We still get a completely even bezel all the way around the rest of the screen, unlike most phones which do still have a little chin at the bottom, all while having no sacrifice to the quality of the selfie camera, which we have seen on phones that have tried to be a little bit more experimental, or to Face ID, which is the best facial recognition on a phone. Could Apple have made a more dramatic visual redesign? Probably. Would it have come at the cost of other things? Most likely. So I'm pretty happy with this one. But also, before I watched this launch event, I was fully ready to complain about how Apple had kept the base storage option on the iPhone 13s at 64 gigs. Because honestly, in 2021, that's just not good enough. However, they've upgraded that too. All iPhone 13s start with 128 gigs of storage. And actually, the top version of the iPhone 13 Pro goes all the way up to 1 terabyte now, while starting at the same price as last year's phones. Actually, cheaper here in the UK. So I'm not gonna complain about that. But what about when you're using the phone? Well, I'm really, relieved actually that battery has been a priority. For the longest time, companies have been fighting with battery life. Essentially, the bigger it is, the better for consumers long term. But then, the less appealing the thing becomes in the moment because of its thickness and weight. And I think that this has plagued Apple even more so than with other companies, just because of how much emphasis they put on the in-hand feel. You can tell that iPhones have always tried to carefully tread that line, resulting in never giving too much battery, but sometimes falling on the side of just not giving enough. But this year, for maybe the first time ever, it looks like they're finally giving users some buffer room. Both the 13 mini and 13 Pro are getting an extra 1.5 hours of screen on time, and both the normal 13 and the 13 Pro Max are getting an extra 2.5 hours. I am going to do a full battery, maybe even a charging speed test too though, so if you do want to see those, then a sub to the channel would be revitalizing. But it's looking promising. Oh yeah, and I'm so glad that this year the screens are not just brighter, but we are getting a feature that has been sorely missing for a long time on iPhones, that the entire tech community has been banging on about for the last 3 years non-stop. Finally, Apple has added in 120Hz refresh rates. Instead of every other iPhone up until this point, whose screen is refreshed 60 times per second, the iPhone 13 Pro and iPhone 13 Pro Max will refresh at up to 120. If you know what you're looking for, then this is going to be the biggest jump in perceived speed that we've ever had on an iPhone. Now, let's be very clear about something. These are not the first phones to get 120Hz displays. Actually, they're pretty much the last. But that doesn't change how significant the upgrade is. As with quite a few things on this iPhone 13 lineup, I would see it less like Apple has just suddenly come in and added some next level feature, and a bit more like Apple has finally removed one of the major thorns on their side. These major caveats that I've had to constantly remind people were missing every time I mentioned the last 2 years of iPhones. Not anymore. You do only get 120Hz on the Pro phones, which is kind of unfortunate given that it's almost an assumed feature on all Android flagships, but I can kind of understand it. You've got to remember that for the entire year, while Samsung might release 50 smartphones, Apple is only making 4. And so because these 4 phones have to serve such a huge, diverse mix of customers, it makes sense from a business perspective to have at least one option that doesn't use all the expensive tech that there is a big portion of users who just won't appreciate. There is another side to this argument though. I'm getting there. But the point I'm making is, if we actually do get better battery life this year, whilst also being able to have these smooth, high refresh rate screens, then that is an enormous win. I'm also just generally excited to see what this new A15 chipset can do. If you watched the launch event, you'll have seen that this new chip has a 50% faster CPU and a 30% faster GPU. Those are crazy numbers.
What a spectacular set of announcements.
But if I'm being really honest, I think the way that Apple has pitched this is a little misleading. Like, if you look closer, you'll realize that what they're actually saying is not 50% faster than last year, like you'd kind of assume because of how they normally make comparisons to the previous gen, but up to 50% faster than other competitors. So they're effectively picking scenarios that suit their chips, ones in which their past A14 was already ahead of Android, and then running those same scenarios again. Oh, and would you look at that, the A15 is even more ahead. Long story short, we don't actually know how much faster the A15 is than the A14. But just the fact that it is faster, with better and more reliable 5G, makes me excited to test it. Because the A14 powered iPhone 12 Pro Max is the most reliably fluid experience I've had on a smartphone ever. I've used this thing every single day for almost a year now, and I've only ever seen it lag once. And that was effectively when I was trying to see how many objects it could handle on screen at one time. It got to at least 20,000 before it started chugging. And even though you might not even actually notice that extra power in day-to-day tasks, you probably will when it comes to the camera. So, for starters, it enables the new cinematic video mode. See, Apple has had portrait mode photos for a while now, and when it was first introduced in the iPhone 7 Plus, that in itself was a pretty strenuous task. You had to process the data from 2 separate cameras, you had to create a depth map and then apply different levels of blur to different parts of the image according to that depth map. However, 5 generations of chips later, we finally have enough processing power to be able to perform a similar type of computation 30 times per second. Now, I will say that this footage looks a little soft around the edges, where you can tell that this is shot on a phone and not a pro DSLR camera, but look at it. From what we can see right now, this is far more advanced than I ever expected the first generation implementation to be. And I'm telling you now, this is the beginning of something huge. When this tech improves, using phones to make movies is going to be a complete no-brainer. They're cheaper, they're so much smaller, and they're smarter. Like, shooting cinematic video with this iPhone, you already have the ability to refocus video after you've taken it. If I shoot out of focus video on this camera, I'm screwed. Plus, this phone can use its ultra-wide camera to anticipate when someone is about to walk into the frame of the main camera and get the focus ready for them. I don't know how well it works yet, but if this is as good as they're making it look, this is very big news. Plus, I'm just glad that Apple is experimenting. My single biggest complaint about the iPhone 12's cameras was that, yes, they're polished, but they're also just a bit boring compared to the competition. This goes a long way towards fixing that. But also, every single one of these new iPhone 13s has a feature called sensor shift stabilization. It means that instead of the lens moving to try and counteract your hand movements, it's the camera sensor behind that lens doing the moving. We already saw this on the iPhone 12 Pro Max last year, and It's not a dramatic improvement, but it edges the iPhone closer to what I'd call human stabilization. By which I mean that you can already get phones like the Vivo X60 Pro Plus that have an actual gimbal system inside their camera for footage so smooth that it looks like the camera's locked in position. I don't think Apple wants this. They actually like that little bit of motion, they're just trying to make it smoother. But there's actually a slightly more fundamental hardware improvement this time round. Every single camera on every single one of these new iPhone 13s has been upgraded. So for the iPhone 13 and 13 mini, you have a new main camera with a larger sensor that apparently lets in 47% more light, and then also an upgraded ultra-wide camera to, I guess, try and keep parity. And put simply, bigger sensors equals more light equals better photos. Based on the sample photos Apple's given though, I would say that it still feels like there's a big gap between the main camera and the ultra-wide. Now, here's where the iPhone 13 Pros start to pull ahead. It really does feel like Apple is making sure that the Pros feel pro this year, but then they've kind of kept the normal iPhone 13s as the more simple, iterative upgrade for people who just don't care about their phone as much, and who just upgrade mindlessly every time their contract runs out. Because on the Pro iPhones, the zoom camera has been upgraded to 3x optical zoom, the ultra-wide now lets in a lot more light, up to 92% they're saying, and then the main camera can apparently let in 2.2 times more light. I don't know how you can put an exact number on how much better a camera is, but these are huge claims. And what makes them even more significant is that at the same time, they've also equipped this new ultra-wide with the ability to autofocus, which allows it to double up as a close-up macro camera. A macro camera that can get all the way up to 2 centimeters away from an object, and one with all that extra light that the sensor now lets in. For a lot of phones, the macro camera is a separate lens altogether, so the fact that Apple has just added basically a 2-in-1 on these phones almost gives these Pros the equivalent of having a quad camera system. There's also apparently the ability on these Pros to create your own custom image preset for how you want your photos to look straight out of the camera. Definitely need to test this one myself though. And finally, you might know that last year's iPhone 12s could shoot photos in a format called ProRAW. You see, with normal iPhone photos, at the point of capture, a lot of the data in that shot is thrown away, because most people don't need it. But by enabling ProRAW, photos do take up about 8 times as much storage, but they allow you to keep that information, which means that in the future, if you ever wanted to come back and edit it, it will look good, even if you go crazy with the image. Now, the reason that I'm telling you this is that with the iPhone 13 Pro, you can also shoot in something called ProRes, which is a very similar concept for videos. It is really cool. Like, I totally believe that smartphones will record movies in the near future, but it also will almost definitely kill your storage. It's possible that they have somewhat optimized the files, but if we went off current industry standards, if you wanted 4K high-quality ProRes video, just 10 minutes would take up 100 gigabytes of storage, or the entirety of a base iPhone 13 Pro. Actually, mind you, this is probably why they're giving you the option for 1 terabyte this year. All that said, there are a few things I'm concerned about. Okay, not you. First of all is the entire iPhone's charging situation. For starters, no iPhone 13s come with a charger. I'm not surprised. When Apple makes decisions, they're generally very purposeful and they try to stick to them. But the added layer to this is that the only cable you get in the box is a USB-C to Lightning cable, which means that you also need a USB-C charging brick to use it, which, unless you specifically bought an iPhone 11 series phone, you probably won't have. But on top of that, it really feels like Apple is pushing this narrative that MagSafe, this snap-on magnetic charging solution, is the way forward. Except that I'm really struggling to see the benefit. It's slow, at 15 watts of max power, compared to the over 100 watts that competitors are now releasing. It generates heat, because the simple fact that you're no longer connecting metal to metal directly means that a higher proportion of the energy is being wasted. And more fundamentally, it's not even more convenient. If you fully buy into the MagSafe ecosystem, then every time you want to charge, you have to take off your accessory and put it back on afterwards. Plus, you're still tied to a cable. It's not like this wireless charging suddenly means you can forget about wires, it just makes that wired charging more indirect. And then also, the second thing is this whole situation with comfort. Look, I can see why Apple has gone with this whole flat design with their phones. It does look slick. But just speaking from experience, I strongly dislike how it feels. And it's looking very likely that given the increased battery on all these iPhone 13s, they're going to be just as sharp, but now even thicker and even heavier. Don't get me wrong, the extra battery is great, but I'm just saying, be warned, because I don't expect, well, particularly the 13 Pro Max, to be particularly palm-friendly. We'll find out very soon though. Alright, taking all of this into account, bearing in mind that no one has actually tested these in person yet, how do these new iPhones sit versus the competition? Well, I think that the iPhone 13 Pros seem really competitive. The A15 chip, 120Hz refresh rates, combined with Apple's optimizations, all means that there is a good chance that you are looking at the new fastest phones on the market. And if Apple can do that whilst improving the battery life and making the camera fun again, they've pretty much tackled every major complaint that I've had with the iPhone all in one go, whilst actually making it cheaper in some regions. However, at the same time, I think that the normal iPhone 13 and the iPhone 13 mini are a bit less competitive. As well as the expected material differences between normal and Pro, not having 120Hz is a huge deal for a flagship phone in almost 2022. And the fact that they miss out on a lot of the major camera upgrades too means that I could see myself telling people to either go Android or just get the Pro. It kind of feels like with the Pro iPhones, Apple is looking at the competition and they're trying to make something that's competitive and that matches their features. But for the normal iPhone 13s, it just feels like Apple is banking on the loyalty that they have to their brand as a reason to not push forward as much as they could. They even actually said that the reason they've shuffled the cameras into this new diagonal position is to make the phones look different, because you might not be able to tell otherwise. But I've got a few big comparisons coming up soon, which will give us more definitive answers. So if you did enjoy this, then do consider subscribing for those. I'm literally not going to finish editing this video till like 6 in the morning. To check out my Dear Apple video, click here. Or to see the craziness that is the company Tesla, click here. My name is Aaron, this is Mr. Who's the Boss, and I'll catch you in the next one.